Good morning again. It is Friday, March 17th, day 15 of Lent, and we are continuing our Romans study. I'm Father Patrick from St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Manhattan, Kansas, and today we're jumping into chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, an analogy from marriage. This section feels like a little bit of a non sequitur, seeing as how Paul has been talking about sin and death and being in the camp of sin or being in the camp of Christ. But the Greek actually helps us understand this a little bit better. So we'll jump right into it. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. Do you not know, brothers and sisters, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law is binding on a person only during that person's lifetime? Thus, a married woman is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is discharged from the law concerning the husband. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, and if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. In the same way, my friends, you have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear the fruit for God. While we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now that we are discharged from the law, dead to that which held us captive, so that we are slaves not under the old written code, but to the new life of the Spirit. So Paul's been talking about being under sin or being under Christ, and that we have this decision that the gates of life have been opened to us if we only choose to behave in a way that shows that we are no longer under the power of sin, but have chosen to be under the under the camp of Christ. And so he jumps into this analogy for marriage where he's talking about the marriage laws of the Jewish people, specifically a law that's remarked on in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, where if a woman goes and lives with another man while her husband is still alive, she's considered an adulteress, and that adultery is punishable by death. And so he's saying, listen, if you're married and you're a woman, you're only bound to that law of being married to your husband as long as your husband is alive. That law is gone when the husband dies. Which seems like it's like, why is he now talking about marriage? He was just talking about broader concepts of life and death and sin. So what is that about? Well, it helps us when we can learn a lot by noticing what word he uses to describe marriage. The normal Greek word for marriage, and the one that's used throughout the New Testament, especially in Jesus' parables, is the word gamos, which comes from the Greek word gam, which means to bind together, right? So in marriage, two are bound together, right? But he uses a different word, which also means marriage, but betrays what he's really trying to get at here. Instead of gamos, he uses hupandros. And so that's our word for the day. I'll put both of these up underneath. But hupandros should sound familiar because it sounds a lot like hupamartia. Hupamartia was our word a few days ago, which meant under sin. Hupandros is a word that does mean marriage, but it means under a man. Right? Okay, so notice the difference there. Instead of gamos, the generally accepted word the more common word for marriage, which means to bind together, which is a little bit more egalitarian, Paul is pointing out how the Jewish law places the power of the relationship on the man in a heterosexual marriage, right? He's saying when you are married, but when I say married, I'm really saying when you are under a man as a woman, as long as that man is alive, if you choose to go live with another man, you're an adulteress and you can be stoned. Okay, so all this, so he's using under man instead of under sin, and so there we see the message. Paul's using a marriage here as an example of how we have been bound to sin, and we have been bound to sin because we've been bound to the law. But because of Christ's death, our husband's death or whatever, the law has been destroyed, or the power of the law over us has been destroyed. The power of sin over us is destroyed. So we are no longer under the man. We're no longer married to the law. We're no longer married to sin. We can choose to live a life of Christ, which then leads to the ability to bear fruit for Christ, which is another favorite analogy of Paul from his other letters, and that we can now live according to the Spirit instead of according to the flesh. He talks a little bit about the flesh here. Again, we talked about the flesh, sarkos, yesterday. He's going to really dive into this on Monday. Tomorrow, for our last video for the week, he's going to hint at it, but then he really dives into spirit and flesh for our reading on Monday, which is in the middle of chapter 7. So anyway, analogy for marriage. All right, so let's go to our thought of the day. Thought for the day. He uses the word hupandros to mean under a man. What else are you under? What are some other ways to describe the relationship you have with the things within your life, right? You may be bound to your television shows, right? But are you married to your television shows in a mutually beneficial relationship, or are you your television shows? Are you under your television shows? Do they have a power over you? Do you enjoy an occasional beverage and alcoholic beverage and are able to control that? Are you united with alcohol in a helpful and friendly way? Or are you under the power of alcohol? That's the question. What things in your lives are you under? What things have control over you? Lent is a time to identify those things and then to remove them from your life and remove the power from them from your life. Have a great Friday, and we'll see you again tomorrow on Saturday.